This is Wayne Roseberry of Software Testing. One of the things that happens in testing an application is sometimes we have state and business logic workflows for a user in a UI that constrain user behaviors or constrain the state of the system in a way that makes us believe that certain things aren't possible, certain things will never happen. And sometimes we're mistaken about that. Sometimes something really will happen. We just don't understand how it comes together in the UI or other layers to make it possible. One of the ways of testing for this, not being fooled into these kinds of assumptions, is to take the problem out of the flow that the UI forces you into and breaking the commands, steps, parts into individual pieces and then start mixing them up. Usually easier to do if we go below UI and into API methods where things are easier to change up the order of things in ways that the UA might seem to constrain. When we do that, we often discover paths that we didn't know were possible and states that might be very bad. I show one way of doing this in this video, using simple table structures to create those kinds of combinations that are really kind of easy to think of if you just take the step. Let's go take a look.
Okay, let's talk about the case where we have an app, like a web app or something, that's got a UI which is taking us through paths. And let's just imagine it's like little tab dialogues, right? And they go through a sequence and they have some branching possibilities. Right, you've got your buttons that take you here. Let's say this one has like a select list, and we can have a button here, or a button that goes there, a button here, button here. Sort of doesn't matter really what the buttons are looking like. Just make sure you get the size. And then the flow goes like this, right? We got the branch there. So the user's guide along on these paths. And now if we think about these as methods that may be supporting them on the back end. So we've got some API methods that are called in each of these parts of the UI sequence. So then we've got method 1, right, and then 2, 3, 4, let's say 5, okay, and we just label these here. It's like we got 1 called here, got 2 called here, 3 called here, 4 called here, 5 called here, okay. Now let's pretend we are thinking about this. Well, conventionally people think about this as like test cases, right? So, where each test case is a traversal of the UI in some way. So if we do this, then we've got, number 1, which consists of going 1, 2, 3. Then we've got number 2, which consists of going 1, 2, 4, 5. And that's it. It winds up being 2 test cases, which isn't actually very interesting, right? It's just 2 ways through the app. Are we covering all we care about? Are we of the API methods that we're interested in, and the coverage and the functional coverage of the app? Is this all we care about? A lot of people will constrain themselves to this and say that these are the valid cases, right? Therefore, everything else is uninteresting, right? If it's not valid, it's uninteresting, as they say. Or these are the user flows. These are the most important. Therefore, that's what you should do. But if we think of it only that way, then we wind up being very constrained. And I'm going to redraw this just as circles and lines to kind of highlight some of the things that come up. So you know, you got, you know, 1, 2, 3, 4. It looks almost the same, right? But we can start, you know, inferring some possibilities when we think of it this way. Okay. I mean, even though the UI constrains this way, you know, what about, I'll pick another color here to just kind of, you know, count. What about going from 4 to 3, or what about going 3 back to 2, or, you know, what about cycling just on the same thing? You know, what are other ways that we can go through? Well, because the UI itself blocks those, we don't think of those jumps, right? We kind of get stuck in our head by what the UI constrains, even though it might be interesting to contemplate what happens with each of these. So now let's think about this from a different approach, right? Instead of, you know, just the UI paths, instead of like, I don't know, workflow or a flow chart of, you know, the logic through the UI of the business logic, we can go a layer down and say, well, what about these API methods? What is there a way we can come up with some tests that will force us to think of things we hadn't thought of? And let's think of it this way. We want to come up with sequences, right? And let's just make this a simple sequence. Essentially, a 2-step sequence. Now, I'll talk about this in a second. We're going to be forced into more than 2 steps if you think about it. Possibly, maybe not. Okay, let's just say a 2-step sequence, and we'll call that action 1 and action 2. Okay, and what we're going to do is we're just going to take the methods and, you know, put them in each column, right? And we think of it that way, right? And so the expansion is like, you know, each sequence from action 1 times action 2, which gives us, and we get 25 sequences that we can try. Now, there's actually, we could even think of a permutation of this. We could say, we could do this by just saying, you know, just you know, A1 and A2, right? Just call them directly in the UI, in the API. You know, this one followed by that one, or get to A1 according to UI rules, right? Logic, UI logic, then A2. And this is interesting because now I kind of thought of this difference here. Well, think about it. Instead of 25, we actually, this does that times 2 now, right? We've got 50 things we can try. We can just say flat out try action 1 and then action 2, or do the normal UI way of getting to action 1 and then try action 2, right? Because the state may be different. And you think about it, there's a lot more tests going here than just 2. But that derives 50 cases, but 50 cases is not that arduous. And what if we've got a situation where going straight from 3 up here to 5 or 4 down here is a problem, right? So this particular combination, 3 to 4 or 3 to 5, right? What if these create a problem? Whereas in the other analysis where we're thinking about this based on UI business logic, we're probably not going to think of that. On the second one, where we're thinking of just combinations, just say, let's just take everything and buy everything in 2 steps, right? We think of it because it just falls out of doing it, right? And this isn't a hard thing to say. Why don't we just try it? And here's the trick. On this side, on the left side here, our thinking is constrained by the use cases, right? It's like we're putting our thinking in a little box. In this, our thinking is opened by possibilities, right? Another way we can say is, it's constrained by the UI flow, where this one is opened by the API, right? It's a different layer of in the application architecture where we can do the testing. And we're probably going to find things that we didn't realize, that in one of these methods or one of these API calls, it assumes certain things are never true, certain things are always true, and when those are violated, we get into a bad state, and that's where we find bugs we weren't expecting. This particular case, or this idea, actually happened to us once on a product I was working with, where the UI had a flow very much like what we see here. The user could take different paths. It was very constrained, and we got a call from support where the user had double entries for something they should never have a double entry for, and the UI enforced that never to happen. The UI always made sure that we were in a state that the user only had one thing, but somehow the user had double entries, right? And it was like, how? How did this happen? Well, what the developer, in investigating the logs, found is that this user had gone in and started the sequence in their browser using Chrome, and got into some partway state, and then for some reason executed a similar sequence using Firefox. They had 2 browsers open at the same time, going through the same flow, and that caused the browsers, which didn't know about each other, didn't recognize the rails that they put up, because it was all in JavaScript, right? And so the one can't see into the other. One of those instances created that double entry state. And it's because it was allowed in the UI. Somewhere in the UI methods was an allowed violation, right? That was enforced in UI, preventing the violation. And it was only found after a user accidentally got there. Had we taken an analysis that was not UI based, but instead test below the UI enforcement, we would have found that the business logic of the system had a flaw in it, where it couldn't protect itself from bad states. And so, this type of analysis, this type of testing probably would have caught the error before we had a user who was in a bad data state, and we couldn't work with them until we touch the database and fix it up directly. So it's this kind of thing that we talk about, where we shake ourselves out of our constraints and into possibilities, by imagining a new way to think about the problem than we have been. All right, thank you.